Star Wars 7 by 7 episode 2410. Today, part 2 of my conversation with Daniel José Older, author of, among other things, The High Republic Adventures. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7 by 7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So once again, here's the deal with Daniel. Daniel José Older, a lead story architect on the Star Wars cross-platform initiative The High Republic, is the New York Times best-selling author of the sci-fi adventure Flood City, the middle-grade historical fantasy series Dactyl Hill Squad, the Book of Lost Saints, the Bone Street Rumba urban fantasy series, Star Wars Last Shot, and the award-winning young adult series The Shadow Shaper Cipher, which won the International Latino Book Award and was shortlisted for the Kirkus Prize in Young Readers Literature, the Andre Norton Award, the Locus, the Mythopoeic Award, and named one of Esquire's 80 books every person should read and one of Time's best fantasy books of all time. He co-wrote the upcoming graphic novel Death's Day and writes the monthly IDW comic book series The High Republic Adventures. You can find more info and read about his decade-long career as a New York City paramedic at danieljoseolder.net. And speaking of that paramedic history, we are going to pick up the conversation at that particular point where we're going to talk about a character called Torban Buck, who, if you've heard Daniel in any interviews about the High Republic talking about buckets of blood, well, that's right where we're going at the start of this. And we're going to talk about other characters as well and how other characters can be appearing in other stories. And we're also going to talk about the cross-collaboration between Cavan Scott and Daniel for the Rising Storm and Race to Crash Point Tower as well. So yeah, without further ado, here is the second half of my conversation with Daniel José Older, author of IDW's Star Wars The High Republic Adventures. Actually, so I'll ask you another question, which is probably going to be a question that you will be asked frequently. Every once in a while we joke on the show about how anybody who is ever associated with Star Wars, that they can do interviews with anyone and somebody's going to ask them about Star Wars, period, paragraph. It doesn't matter what they do in the world. I have a feeling that it's going to be this way with interviews with you and somebody asking you about Torban Buck.
Oh, yes. Well, yes, as it should be. I mean, buckets of blood.
There it is. Okay.
I mean, it has to be said, right? It has to be said like that. Otherwise,
yes.
He won't answer if it's not said the right way. So what's the point?
Right. So
yes.
So obviously, well, not obviously, I'll back up and say that this was inspired by a character, by a person that you knew from your days as a paramedic. How has the experience been of, taking the idea of this person that you carried around with you and fleshing that character out as a fully fledged person within Star Wars?
Right. Well, first of all, actually, let me make a small correction. But he was like street lore by the time I came around. So we didn't overlap that I know of as workers. He was probably a couple years before me, but people talked about him, which actually makes it even better. So I never knew the real buckets of blood. He's out there somewhere. And I'm sure I know there's EMS people that follow me and are Star Wars fans. So one day, I expect an email from someone being like, "Hey, I'm buckets of blood. You made a Star Wars character." But hopefully it's friendly. You never know. But
right.
But so that also allowed me to kind of just run with it a little more, right? Like I didn't know the actual buckets of blood. Hopefully he never copyrighted his nickname, but I could, because of that, it really just became like the idea of a healer who's kind of like steeped in gore. It still tickles me, and I just thought it was so hilarious. That he described himself in the third person. I cannot stress enough, like, that you don't do that on the radio. Like, you can't. First of all, you can't deny jobs. Like, not when I was around. I think it was a little more Wild West in the era that he worked. But if you're given a job on the EMS radio, like, you have to go to that job. Like, you can't just be like what he was, which was buckets of blood doesn't do abdominal pain. And also, like, I I deeply understood where he was coming from because I also hate doing abdominal pains. Like you're there as a paramedic, and theoretically are there to save people's lives. And yes, people can die from abdominal pain, but not often. Usually
Right.
not on scene. Usually it's long-term type of problems,
Mm-hmm.
unless they got stabbed and that's why they're having abdominal pain. But the point is, not all of us, most of us medics were kind of there with our training to like do some real world, life saving. And obviously, like the real world means that most of the time you're dealing with bureaucracy, earaches, nonsense, drunks, and the same guy who calls every week because he's about to have a seizure but never has a seizure. And that's the job. That's the reality of the job. So that made that character even more heroic in a way. It was like, we all want to be that person that could just come up on the air and be like, Daniel's not doing that job. Send me a shooting. You know what I mean? And it's called a buff when you are the person who shows up on other people's jobs because they sound gory. And so he would do that. He would be like, buckets of blood is responding to that shooting. And he would apparently like be covered in blood, which was also a relic of another time when that wasn't as problematic as it is now.
Yes.
So, that's just there's so many levels to that character. And I did distinctly like bring that character up as soon as we started sort of just being like, so who are the Jedi of the High Republic going to be? I was like, buckets of blood. And everyone was like, that's amazing. And I was like, great. So then, Torban Buck was his obvious name. And then I just he was just on the character list for a while. And I don't know, I think people probably were like, we'll let Daniel touch that. Like, he doesn't have to be whatever. There's there's tons of characters that haven't even shown up yet, believe me. So then I just needed sort of a secondary Jedi to show up in the IDW, and I was like, you know who I could use? Buckets of blood! There he is. But it was Harvey that made him Chagrian, because in the script he's actually just described as a big muscly Jedi.
Ah, okay.
And Harvey was like, the first sketch just has him as a kind of a vague humanoid, and then Harvey was like, you know what, he should be a Chagrian. And I was like, absolutely, that's perfect.
So there's not necessarily concept art from him that was developed prior. This is Harvey going into it.
It's all Harvey.
Got it.
Harvey.
I have to imagine that if somebody is reporting abdominal pain because of a stabbing, that's kind of like burying the lead in a way.
You know what? It happens. And what's so weird about the system, this is a whole other conversation, but like, like it's broken down in like what you say when you call, right? So, and different like level of care will be sent to you based on what you say, to the point that if you literally call and you say like, I'm unconscious, they will send you paramedics make it a high level call because you're unconscious. Someone is unconscious, and so they need medics. So they'll send you to the job, and it'll be like, caller states that he is unconscious, and you're like, okay. Here we come. Buckets of blood does unconscious.
So, as far as other characters that you are writing for the High Republic Adventures, which character or characters would you say has surprised you the most as you have delved into character and story, and what has particularly surprised you about that character or characters?
Sure. Really interesting. So I think one thing that's really cool about the IDW High Republic Adventure series, and you will get this right away from the first issue, if you probably already grasped it from the first 3 pages, is that it's an epic story, like unto itself. It is very much like a gigantic saga within the larger saga, and very interconnected, obviously, to the larger saga of the High Republic. But like these characters, they have a long way to go in what's coming, and that's really exciting. And so one of the ones that I think a lot about, Lula is obviously like really like leading the show, and she's incredible. But Zine, who we meet right off the bat in that first issue, grew up in a community that doesn't trust the Jedi, that doesn't think anyone should use the Force. Like the Force is basically like taboo, and she's Force sensitive, and she's grown up having to hide that from everyone around her who loves and takes care of her, including her best friend. And I just find that to be like such a complicated and real world problem that a lot of people have, and that we're kind of asked to lessen ourselves sometimes around the very people who are supposed to protect us and take care of us. I can fortunately say that that hasn't been my experience, but I think it's one that I know from a lot of friends who've just grown up in different situations for different reasons that, you know, they've had to really just like pretend they don't have the power they have and how complex that is. So, you know, putting Zine in a position where she is now face to face with the very people that A, she's been taught to distrust, but B, she kind of is like one with and connected to on this very deep level that she's not connected to her actual people. I thought that was a really interesting situation to kind of get into, especially as like an opening moment, right? To like really break open the whole story. And I'm still being surprised by it. Like, I know a bunch of beats down the road as far as what's going to happen, but I'm also like, there's a lot of stuff up ahead that I still don't know. And what's really cool is like, it might not be in my hands, you know, like the nature of this project is we're tossing a lot of things around and characters are popping up in different projects. So it might fall to another writer to write. And I'm, you know, also really excited about that possibility because I trust the writers I work with, and it'll be cool to see what they do with the characters.
And I feel like you and maybe Cavan as well are in kind of a unique situation in that regard, because the nature of comics tends to be very story arc related in that you'll do, you know, maybe 6 or 7 issues and then it moves on to another story arc entirely. And so you're leaving characters behind potentially that that I don't feel like, you know, in a novel situation it really happens the same way. Like, are you feeling that kind of experience, or am I putting something on it that isn't there?
That's interesting. I don't know. I'm sort of in the thick of it all, so it's hard to say. But it does feel similar to a novel in a lot of ways when I kind of look at the grand trajectory of it. I think the really complicated part, honestly, is that we're following these characters into novels and then back out again. Mm-hmm. So Lula shows up in the middle grade that comes out this summer. And has experiences in that middle grade. She's one of the main point of view characters, right? So she has important experiences, and that's an arc for her. And then she returns to the regular scheduled programming of the IDW, right, with new friends and everything else. So then it becomes like, how do you kind of allude to that without being annoying and making the middle grade like, you know, like this essential part, but also it's essential, but also you can't feel like you're missing out just because you didn't read a whole book. And that's really sort of the challenge of the whole project. But I do think because it is... Sorry. God forbid a human being or dog come near the house. My goodness. So yeah, you know, I think because we're considering that as one of the main challenges, which is to say make the story interconnected, but also make each one stand on its own. That's kind of the answer to the question, is like, consider this a part of the challenge and make it work. So we do, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. And I will ask you about one particular character as well, because
sure.
I think you are, at least so far, the only person who is really writing at any significant level a character that we're all familiar with, which is Yoda.
Yes.
And I got to thinking about this in terms of, so Michael Arndt, who is the guy who wrote the first draft of the script for The Force Awakens, he talked about how when he was writing it, every time he brought Luke Skywalker in, everything kind of went to a screeching halt because it was just, I just want to see what Luke Skywalker is going to do. And so that's why ultimately, I think with the version that J.J. Abrams and Larry Kasdan did, Luke got pushed to the end so they could set up the story. And so I wanted to ask you just freeform about how you approach Yoda in this story, knowing that, you know, like, people want to see him, people want to know what he's up to, especially 200 years younger, but also knowing that you really have a story to tell that isn't, you know, about Yoda, that he's actually a supporting player for all of this.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely a complex piece of the whole thing. It's like he is a piece of the puzzle, but he's a huge piece of the puzzle, even in that tiny body. I guess that speaks to his whole thing. It's like, what does size really mean when you have the Force, right?
Yep.
But for me, it was like that's part of why he's in there so early on. Really, it's like he's one of the first characters you see, and he's been traveling with these Padawans, you know, for the duration of their journey around the galaxy. And they just know him, you know. So he's a big deal. He's huge in the galaxy as well as as much as he is in the world outside of the galaxy, he's also a big deal in world, obviously. But it's like when you hang out with a celebrity, after a while, you do get used to it. Like you stop crying all the time or whatever. And so they're a little bit used to him right now, and they're very focused on the mission because there's a whole lot going on, and they really have to, look and admire and want to be like one day, especially who's very, really focused on trying to be a great Jedi. But he doesn't. We're not in his point of view, right? Because it's a story about young people.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, do you find yourself?
And he definitely.
Oh, go ahead.
Did I lose you?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Yeah, I can. Yeah.
It got a little spotty there for a moment. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
You were talking about Yoda not being the primary person,
right?
Whose point of view the story is told
through.
through.
The plot, right? Like he definitely plot points do revolve around him in different ways, but he's not the one. Like we're not seeing through his eyes for the most part. There's little moments here and there. But yeah, and that's kind of the whole game is like that. He's there. He's a presence. He's important. He's basically almost an Obi-Wan figure. Of Obi-Wan from A New Hope,
Mm-hmm. I'm so grateful for all the time that you've taken out of your schedule to chat with me and to share all this stuff with our listeners. And for anyone who wants to keep up with what you have going on, whether it's Star Wars or your own particular projects, where should people be keeping track of your ongoing activities?
So my website is DanielJoseOlder.net, DanielJoseOlder.net. All my books are up on there. Also, if you're curious about my ambulance career, my paramedic career, I did keep a blog during that period, and that's all archived on my website.
Awesome.
So that's over there. On Twitter, I'm at DJ Older. I'm also on TikTok now, which is really fun, and it's just at my full name, Daniel Jose Older. TikTok has a really cool Star Wars community happening, with just amazing stuff happening all around. The one thing I wanted to say about Race to Crash Point Tower before we go, which I think is really cool, is that it's more than I think any of the work yet. And this is kind of indicative of the direction we're moving anyway, but the way that Race to Crash Point Tower ties in directly with The Rising Storm is really something to behold. Like those two books it's like other books kind of run parallel and comics and stuff. These two books literally cross paths in really interesting ways, and that's so much the essence of what this initiative is about. And it's such a cool thing. It's been so much fun to be able to pull that off, with Cav, who I really admire and just love as a person. But it's really cool to see. So that's just something I'm excited for readers to check in on and be like, oh, that's that guy who, literally just the crossover is at another level with those two books. So get ready for that.
Okay, so you're opening a door that I'm going to walk through, and we'll see how far I get into the room. So for listeners who aren't sure, The Rising Storm is the adult novel that's written by Cavan Scott. That is sort of the second wave of Phase 1 of the High Republic Publishing Initiative. And as I recall, it has to do with something that's the equivalent of a World's Fair that's being put on by the Republic and things that happen as a result. And so when you talk about the two novels crossing paths with each other, can you talk a little bit about the process of developing the two novels, as opposed to the first part of the launch of the High Republic with everything that's come out? You're away from Skywalker Ranch. You're done with your initial forays into the world. Now this second part of the first phase is happening. How does this work? Does Michael Siglain call you and say, hey, I want these two novels to kind of interleave with each other, and you guys figure out how that works? Or what happens? Well,
we have a lot of meetings, all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll be talking through plot points in the meetings, and I don't remember specifically with that one if it was Mike. Or sometimes Mike will be like, I feel like these two can, whatever. It depends, but for however we landed on it, I think it was Cav who started with some of the bigger beats, and I kind of ran with that, and then was like, okay, this is how I can weave my character into these moments. And then we went back and forth a whole bunch. And then as we started to kind of hone in on like, okay, these are the actual scenes that are really going to matter, on top of like, here's the larger beat for beat of like different events that are going on. So how are we going to make sure that they kind of link, and where do we have to be vague about time? Because that's what's complicated. And where do we have to be really critical and like specific about time? You know, all those pieces. So, you know, Cav and I would have just separate calls, just the two of us, just to kind of map out certain things. And then we would bounce drafts and particular scenes off each other. It was just a constant bouncing back and forth of material.
Ah, that's good fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
And thank you so much for all of your time today. Daniel José Older, I am so thrilled and honored to have had you as a guest on the show. Thank you again
My pleasure.
so much for your time and your insights.
You are very welcome. Thanks for having me, and take good care.
And there you go. That is going to do it for my conversation with Daniel José Older, author of The High Republic Adventures, a lead story architect on the whole High Republic storytelling initiative, author of Last Shot and short stories in both From a Certain Point of View story compilations, and of course a whole bunch of other wonderful stories as well. And so I will have all of his stuff linked at the show notes for this show's episode at sw7x7.com, so you can check out more of his work. And that's going to do it for the show. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always. And may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.